Good morning. My name is Christian Osterman, and I oversee the North Korea International Documentation Project here as director of the Center's History and Public Policy Program. And it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you and our distinguished panelists to this second session of our Conference on Peace and Security on the Korean Peninsula. The North Korea International Documentation Project, that is the co-host of today's conference, was established in 2006 in close cooperation with the University of North Korean Studies and the Institute of Far Eastern Studies, both divisions, as was mentioned earlier, of Kyungnam University in South Korea. Together, our two institutions address a critical need of the scholarly and policy-making communities for reliable information on the North Korean political system and foreign relations by widely disseminating newly declassified documents on the DPRK from archives around the world, including, of course, Pyongyang's former communist allies. You'll find examples of some of these translated materials outside on the table, as well as on our website at wilsoncenter.org/nkidp. Today's event is another product of this close cooperation between our two institutions, the North Korea project here at the center, along with the center's Asia program. Very pleased to host the first annual IFES UNKS Washington Forum with our partners in Seoul. Today's event features many leading academics and practitioners to discuss the ongoing North Korean nuclear issue, Sino-DPRK relations, and U.S.-ROK policy coordination on North Korea. This panel will discuss the role of stakeholder nations in resolving the nuclear issue and beyond. We're now 8 years into the second North Korean nuclear dispute. Six-party talks, which began in August 2003, aimed at ending North Korea's nuclear program through negotiations, have been bedeviled, as was mentioned earlier, by diplomatic standoffs and repeated provocations on the part of North Korea. Yet all of the nations involved in the talks, with the exception perhaps of North Korea, seem determined to stick to the six-party framework to resolve the ongoing dispute over the North Korean nuclear program. As the parties participating in the talks with North Korea, the United States, South Korea, China, Japan, and Russia seek to move forward, they must be mindful of the disappointing history of attempts to bring about significant political changes in the North. To provide us with a broader historical framework and to put everything into perspective today, we have four distinguished panelists with us in this session. Our first speaker is Dr. Charles Armstrong, the Korea Foundation Associate Professor of Korean Studies in the Department of History and Director of the Center for Korean Research at Columbia University. Due to some last-minute complications, Charles will be joining us this morning via video conference from New York. Also on the panel this morning, we have Professor Tae-Yun Kim, currently a professor at the Graduate School of International Studies at Kyungang University and a visiting scholar at the Center for International Strategy, Technology, and Policy at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Then we have an old friend of the Center's North Korea project, and in fact the Center's Cold War International History project, Alexander Mansurov. Alexander is a visiting scholar at the U.S.-Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins University, as well as a founding member of the U.S. National Committee on North Korea and a senior associate of the Nautilus Institute. Last but not least, I'm delighted to have to welcome back Professor Kil-jae Ryo, an associate professor at the University of North Korean Studies and a former public policy scholar here at the center. I'd like to ask that all of you hold your questions until the end of the presentation. We'll hopefully have quite a bit of time for questions and comments. We're webcasting this session live as well, so please, again, wait for the microphones when we get to that point. Let me not be remiss in thanking my wonderful staff here at the center, in particular James Person, who really runs our North Korea project, and Timothy McDonald and Christina Tertsieva, and several others who have really put this event in place. Now, without further ado, let me turn it over to Charles for his presentation. Charles.
Thank you very much. How is the sound? Can you hear me?
Beautiful.
Okay, great. My apologies for not being able to attend this conference in the flesh, but I do have a very appropriate excuse. I'm actually meeting an academic delegation from Pyongyang in a couple of hours here at Columbia, so which indicates that despite all of the difficulties we've heard about this morning, there is some movement in U.S.-DPRK relations, enough so that it's forced me to just stay in New York and not be able to come down. This is incidentally a group from the Kimchek University of Technology, so I would be pleased to report to them that we do have working information technology here at Columbia. I wanted to, before I begin, thank Representative Hamilton, Professor Jae-Gyu Park of Kyungnam University, Christian Osterman, and James Pearson, the director of the North Korean International Documentation Project, for organizing this and inviting me to participate. I will try to be as brief as possible to stay within my 15-minute limit, and I'd be happy to take questions in the Q&A session, part of this session. As a professional historian, I have to argue that history matters, but I think history particularly matters for any foreign policy of any country, and especially that of North Korea, which has had only two top leaders over 60 years, and seems itself to be a kind of historical relic and to operate in modes of behavior left over from the past. There's certainly a great weight of history in the way that North Korea deals with the outside world. Rather than talk about the stakeholders in my own presentation here, I'd like to talk, to the extent that I can, about the perspective, as I understand, of North Korea and its dealings with the outside world. I've been working for several years now with the Cold War History Project and the North Korea International Documentation Project to try to piece together a history of North Korea's foreign relations from the founding of the DPRK in 1948, and particularly through the relations of the DPRK with its socialist allies during the Cold War, but with, I think, very important implications beyond that. It seems to me there is actually a remarkable consistency with, in which the way that North Korea has dealt with the outside world, both during and after the Cold War. And that has maintained a kind of fundamental grounding to North Korea's foreign relations to this day, which can be very frustrating for those who deal with North Korea, not only those out in the West or in East Asia, South Korea, that have had an adversary relationship with the DPRK, but even with North Korea's supposedly close allies during the Cold War period. I think that the principle with which North Korea has dealt with the outside world, as we see from its history, can be expressed very simply: maximum extraction at minimum cost. Now, this could be the principle of any foreign policy, but North Korea has been particularly good at getting things that it wanted from the outside world, whether from its allies or even its adversaries. It has been a very successful, perhaps one of the most successful during the Cold War period, of a small or weak state managing to make its way in a hostile international system, and even to manipulate that system to its own advantage. Within the academic literature, there has not been a lot of writing about that in recent decades. But if you look back at the analyses of these so-called weak states in the international system, you find some insights which I think give us a great deal of important perspective on North Korea. One of the early analysts of weak states in World War II suggested that the power of those weak states depends to a great extent on their capacity to convince the great powers that the cost of using coercion against them would more than offset their gains. That is to say, by threatening to deprive a great power of something that it values, or invoking retaliation by a competing great power, by threatening to shift alliance to the other side, a weak state is able to maintain its neutrality in great power conflict while gaining economic, military, or other benefits from the competing powers. And this expresses almost perfectly the way that North Korea dealt with its communist patrons in the Sino-Soviet conflict of the Cold War. And I'll get back to that in a moment. We heard earlier about 60th anniversaries. As it turns out, and Alexander Mansurov particularly knows this very well, this has been part of his research, tomorrow is the 60th anniversary of the date in which Stalin gave the go-ahead for Kim Il-sung to attack the South to set off the Korean War, January 30th, 1950. And from that point onward, I think we can see North Korea's remarkable ability, although of course the Korean War did not turn out as it expected, to have its own way in the world, to maintain a kind of autonomy in the face of a very disadvantaged position. If we look at the post-war reconstruction of the 1950s, the historical record shows a very remarkable set of events. North Korea was, of course, utterly devastated in the Korean War. Its reconstruction was almost entirely dependent on outside aid, especially from the Soviet Union and from China, as well as from Eastern Europe. Each gave about a third of this massive reconstruction aid effort in the period from 1953 to 1960. But it did not make North Korea, despite this dependence on aid, politically dependent on the Soviet Union or China for that matter. Quite the opposite. In the midst of this period of reconstruction, North Korea insisted on its independence. The very expression that defined North Korea's view of itself and its foreign relations for the next several decades, juche, or self-reliance, emerged precisely at this time, at the peak of dependence on aid from the outside world and from its socialist allies, especially in the late 1950s. Indeed, the emergence of juche, which still has important resonances for North Korea today, came out as a response to, as well as a reaction against, the possibility of economic dependence on its socialist allies, but also emerged very importantly out of the Sino-Soviet split, which came about at this time in the late 1950s. So, and in fact, what makes North Korean foreign policy distinct in the Cold War period compared to other small states, even other small socialist states such as North Vietnam, was its position within the Sino-Soviet split, or what I would call the Sino-Soviet Cold War, which gave North Korea the room for maneuverability in order to play China and the Soviet Union against each other, a classic example of the power of weak states in international conflict of great powers, which I alluded to earlier. For example, the intervention of Chinese leader Peng Dehuai and the Soviet leader Anastas McCoy in 1956 to try to get Kim Il-sung to stop the purge of so-called pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese rivals did not work at all. It seemed Kim promised to refrain from this purge, but it went ahead anyway after these foreign visitors left. Why is this? Again, because both China and the Soviet Union had a stake in maintaining the allegiance of North Korea against each other, and neither were really willing to push North Korea to the point of defecting to the other side. North Korea, in other words, during the Cold War period was never anyone's client, although at times it appeared to be closer to the Soviet Union, especially in the mid-1980s when there was a huge increase of military aid from Moscow to North Korea, or to China, which peaked probably in the early 1960s. But really North Korea has pursued its own interest with considerable autonomy. One of the interesting unexplored historical periods, which I have written a working paper on through the NKIDP, it's available on our website, is the 1970s, which I think is worth re-examining when we talk about North Korean engagement strategy today. The 1970s was a time when North Korea attempted to break out of this Cold War impasse and to connect with the outside world, with the capitalist countries of Western Europe and Japan, with other third world countries, and to liberalize to some extent in the early 1980s its economy and its attempt to attract foreign investment. This failed for a number of reasons. But it was not. It therefore suggests to us that the late 1990s and early 2000s was not the first time North Korea attempted to open up to the outside world, and the idea that North Korea has been always this hermetically sealed country is not true. Rather, what's significant about North Korea's foreign policy history is the tactical shifts within the broad strategic consistency of its policy of dealing with the outside world, as North Korea would say, in its own way, with a tremendous emphasis on sovereignty and independence. Now, what threatened North Korea's ability to maintain this autonomy was not so much the end of the global Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, which was, of course, extremely significant, but rather following this pattern of behavior in the Cold War from the late 1950s, it was actually the Sino-Soviet rapprochement at the end of the 1980s, which really undermined North Korea's ability to extract maximum advantage from its communist patrons through its manipulation of their interest in maintaining the closeness of the DPRK. So what then happened with the end of the Cold War? Well, as we may recall, and here again I think history is important not to forget, there were many observers who simply said that North Korea is a relic of the Cold War, and like East Germany or other Eastern European communist states, North Korea would disappear. It would collapse. In fact, this is not what happened. If you look closely at the way North Korea then shifted its relations with the outside world, what seems to have taken place was a decision to look to the United States, ironically enough, as a new partner economically and also politically in terms of resolving the situation of conflict on the Korean Peninsula. And gaining what it could from a new relationship with the United States. And we can trace this to about 1991, when suddenly it appears that North Korea's overtures to the United States increase. This was set back, to say the least, by the first nuclear crisis of 1993-94, which, however, did lead to a new and unprecedented agreement between the DPRK and the U.S. But that this in turn was followed by a very traumatic political change in leadership with the death of Kim Il-sung and the rise of Kim Jong-il, and of course the famine of the late 1990s. Nevertheless, by the end of the decade of the 1990s, North Korea seemed to come back into this attempt to deal more directly with the United States, and accompanying that in part as a response to the engagement policy of South Korea under Kim Dae-jung, to engage also in domestic economic reform. And here, as I mentioned earlier, we see the second expansion of North Korea's relations with the outside world since the 1970s, normalization with a whole host of countries in Southeast Asia and Latin America and Western Europe and so on. The second period of North Korea breaking out. But this, too, ended in disappointment. By the early 2000s, there seems to have been yet another shift in North Korea's dealing with the outside world, as prospects for the U.S.-North Korean relations faded with the second nuclear crisis beginning in 2002 and culminating with the October 2006 nuclear test. At the moment, as we've heard earlier from Deputy Secretary of State Steinberg, North Korea seems to be engaged in a kind of two-track policy. On the one hand, it continues to respond to the six-party talks to a limited extent, but on the other hand, over the last several years, North Korea has emphasized establishing a strong deterrent and coming out explicitly as a nuclear power. This emphasis has increasingly shifted toward the latter over the last few years in particular, a military-first politics, a stress on deterrence, not giving up on a negotiating process, but hedging its bets, keeping the nuclear card at hand as long as possible. At the same time, there has been a retrenchment in domestic economic reform since especially 2005. What we seem to see in North Korea now is a kind of retreat, a return of old modes of behavior, which is possibly related to another succession transition as Kim Jong-il prepares to hand over power to his chosen successor. So, in conclusion, what seem to be the priorities of the DPRK in dealing with the outside world that we can see over the path of its history? I think it's very important to understand how these priorities are set up in order to give us some means of understanding how to deal with North Korea today. First and foremost, North Korea has stressed its sovereignty, meaning the continued existence of the state and its system, but in particular its core leadership. And anything that is seen to threaten that will be rejected. Second, and this is very much a secondary priority, North Korea has emphasized rescuing and improving its economy so long as this does not have a visible threat to priority one. Therefore, we see these movements back and forth to reform and back. And finally, and related again to the first priority, is a sense of the need for prestige and recognition with the outside world to be treated as an equal partner with the United States. Well, what we see over the long historical record is that the so-called stakeholders in North Korea have had relatively little influence on North Korea's behavior, both its domestic behavior, of course, but also in its relations with the outside world, including with the stakeholders themselves. In the debate over whether inducements or punishments, carrots or stick, work in North Korea, I would argue that coercion or threats of coercion have really had very little effect. Inducements have had some effect, but only within the parameters of the way that North Korea deals consistently with the outside world and its stress on sovereignty and autonomy. And finally, our biggest dilemma at the present time in U.S.-North Korean relations is, I think, based fundamentally on a gap, a rather substantial gap in priorities in the way North Korea and the U.S. See the need for North Korea to deal with the outside world and how that should be affected. For the U.S., as we've seen, the emphasis is on non-proliferation, on North Korea's denuclearization before steps can be taken to normalize and to improve economic relations. For North Korea, it's not quite, but almost the opposite, that it is survival and sovereignty that is most important, if necessary, defended by nuclear weapons, and once that security is somehow seen as secure, then they can move toward denuclearization. How to bridge this gap is a very difficult problem and not one that I am going to attempt to address. My perspective here is on the history of how we got here. Where we go from here is up to the policymakers, and how we analyze where we can go is up to the analysts of contemporary affairs here and elsewhere as well. But a review of North Korea's history does not give us much of a basis, I would say, for optimism that this bridge can be crossed anytime soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. I now turn over to Dr. Kim, who again is professor at the Graduate School of International Studies and director of the Center for the Study of Grants Strategy at Yongang University, and as mentioned, a visiting scholar at Georgia Tech.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for kind introduction, and thank you very much for the organizers for inviting me to this prestigious conference. It's prestigious in terms of the location, organizers, panelists, and most of all the audience. I see a lot of faces which I feel humbled in front of them. Okay, let me start with what Deputy Secretary Steinberg left out in the previous. We are talking about the anniversaries. And for this conference, I prepared a 21-page long paper. I thought you had a copy of it, but obviously you don't. It starts with the title on anniversary, not for celebration. And I didn't know that this is the first anniversary of Deputy Secretary Steinberger's appointment. And I was looking for the anniversaries to celebration. Yes, China celebrated huge last year for its 60th birthday of the People's Republic. And Germany celebrated huge for its 20th anniversary of the fall of Berlin Wall, and they will do it again this year for the 20th anniversary for the national unification. What do we have for Koreans? Yes, we will have 60 years anniversary of the Korean War. But I don't think it is an anniversary to celebrate. While I was preparing for this paper, I realized that the interview for the very first job I had after I got my degree in 1991, the topic was North Korean nuclear issue. And I looked at back and found out from Dan Overder's book that the North Korean nuclear issue became first issue in July of 1989. So it is now 20 years old. So we just passed the 20th anniversary of this particular conference. I feel really humbled that this issue outdates my professional career. I looked at my resume, I see many of my publications, op-ed articles are related to this issue, and it still stands there. So taking advantage of the words that President Obama used in his State of the Union address, I cannot but feel humbled in front of this resilience of a social event that lasted for over 20 years, and I presumably it will last another 5 years. During the last 20 years, North Korean nuclear issue has become from suspicion to a possibility, now a reality. Okay? Earlier task for both United States and South Korean allies was to deter North Korea from turning into a nuclear power. Now, the issue is that our task is now to compel North Korea to give up the weapons that they already have developed. And the task is obviously far more difficult than just deterrence. What can we do? I looked at history. From what he has said, I looked at history and whether we had a historical precedent where we failed in deterrence and succeeded in compellence. And I found the instance, of course, that's Cuban Missile Crisis. And United States tried to deter Soviet Union from deploying offensive missiles, weapons in Cuba, and failed. They did it. Okay, so in September 1962, President Kennedy warned specifically that introduction of offensive missiles in Cuba will result in grave consequences. That warning didn't work out, and maybe too late and too light. But eventually, he was successful, the same administration, in forcing Russians to withdraw the missiles from the Cuba, the island of Cuba. The means they chose was a naval blockade, but you all know that it's not possible. It's possible to block introduction of new missiles in the Cuba with a naval blockade, but not possible to take those missiles already there away from Cuba with a naval blockade. So it is a bargaining, not military exercise. And I think we have to pursue the same kind of bargaining to let North Korea give up the weapons they already have. And the bargaining will be tough. In the second session of my paper, I was referring to the rules of game in international politics, where the bargain includes not use, but threat of forces and other forcible measures. When it's successful, it will work. If not successful, we may have difficulties. And I looked at again, and I found another case where we used threat of force, implicit. It wasn't really explicit, but implicit threat of force, and succeeded in forcing those to do something which we wanted. Okay, I was referring to the literature in international relations. One is on deterrence, the other one is coercive diplomacy, both of which Professor Alexander George wrote a lot. Okay, he called the deterrence failure in terms of Cuban Missile Crisis a kind of failure as a fait accompli attempt. And he was referring to successful withdrawal missiles from Cuba as a successful case of coercive diplomacy. And we had a successful coercive diplomacy in our history. This is the 1994 case. I found a case study that calls the 1994 case as a failure in coercive diplomacy, but it depends on how you approach it. Yes, I mean, there are 2 or 3 types of coercive diplomacy, depends on what is your objective. Type A is stopping your opponent short of what they, achieving what they want. And so type B, forcing them to undo what they have already done. If you take the 1994 case as type B, okay, forcing North Korea to undo what they have already done, given whatever official materials they have developed, it was a failure. But if you take it as a type A case, deterring from them or stopping short of what they want, development of further nuclear materials for weapons purposes, then it was success. And it was, but nevertheless, it's a moderate success, okay, type A, the weakest form. But still, it took a nerve-breaking confrontation in the spring of 1994. I remember that. Many of people think that case was resolved by the painstaking diplomacy by the former President Jimmy Carter, his trip to the Pyongyang. But I think it was instrumental and helpful, but it was not critical for the success. I think what was critical was asymmetry of capabilities between North Korea on one hand and US and South Korean allies on the other hand. I mean, it was a typical case of coercive diplomacy. It was kind of, there was an escalation processes. It's funny that it was North Korea, not US or South Korean allies who escalated the processes. So the article I read in 2003 volume at USIP, United States and Coercive Diplomacy, whether it's Darren written an article on that. The title of the paper was, "Who is coercing whom?" He was implying that it was North Korea who was coercing US and South Korea. But at the end, I think North Korea nerve broke down. I remember in June of 1994 that we South Koreans, I lived there, felt vivid threat of war. Okay, I thought war was imminent. Not really me, but most of people. The government was warning people to buy up gas masks. They were teaching people about how to prepare for the war chemical warfare. And people began to stock up emergency fuels and food. And U.S. Embassy was practicing about the evacuation of civilians from the South Korean Peninsula. And I think it was North Korea, not really South Koreans, whose nerve broken down. If the war looked imminent to South Koreans, why not to North Koreans? And so, nevertheless, President Carter's visit to North Korea was very, very instrumental. I will return to that one. Okay, so having said that, to emphasize the rules of the game, that sometimes it requires a bargain from the position of strength. But nevertheless, it requires the art of diplomacy to lead North Korea to give up the weapons they already have. Remember that it was the Soviets who withdrew the missiles from the Cuba, not US forces. Okay, given that North Korea possesses nuclear weapons, it must be North Koreans to give up their weapons, not our forces. And to do so, it requires out of power, I'm saying. Okay, without knowing precisely if and where North Korea, Pyongyang has weapons, the means available to Washington and Seoul and the international community at large are constrained. The best solution is somehow to let Pyongyang give them up voluntarily. They will do so only when they feel the weapons are too hot or too heavy to hold on to any longer. Various unilateral and multilateral direct and indirect measures designed to make them feel so should be ingeniously devised, skillfully crafted, and carefully carried out by all the stakeholders. That is the topic today. That requires an art of power. In all political actions, be they deterrence, coercive diplomacy, blackmail strategy, I think North Korea is applying to that one now. Even the carrot and stick approach, the art of power rests on changing others' minds and actions without using resources. although they were developed from different theoretical traditions, both deterrence and coercive diplomacy theories are based on the same logic. That is, influence the target decision calculus such that the cost of non-compliance outweighs that of compliance, or put it in reverse angle, benefits of compliance outweighs that of non-compliance. So, taking the specific North Korean nuclear issue as an example, we have to make the costs that Pyongyang has to pay to develop and keep nuclear weapons outweigh the benefits that Pyongyang expect to reap from those weapons. What are the benefits and costs that North Koreans are presumably counting on? Let me just give some examples, speculations. Benefits. It could be political or military benefits. Prestige of nuclear weapons states in international worlds, both internationally and maybe domestically as well. Deterrence effects against external threat, that is North Korea is emphasizing. Potential gains from blackmail strategy. I think they are counting on that right now. Economic benefits, profits from foreign sales, nuclear materials, missile technologies, and other things. Reduction of military expenditures if they were able to reduce, if it replaces their conventional forces. And let's talk about the costs. Political military costs. Yes, they are suffering badly from that. International isolation. Domestic discontent. I don't know whether they are outstanding, but I think there are some whispering discontent about it. And military counter effects. Deputy Secretary of State Steinberg just mentioned about what security dilemma is. They are suffering from the security dilemma. And economic costs. Direct cost of development and maintenance. I don't know how big it is. It may be big. And second, opportunity or psychological cost of benefits cost. That is, benefits not realized due to isolation and exclusion. Given this and borrowing jargons from the deterrence theory, our policy may consist of, first one of all, denial strategy. That means designed to deny Pyongyang of any benefits they may expect. And second, punishment strategy designed to increase the real or psychological cost that those weapons incur. Of course, any policy combines both elements of strategies, both denial and punishment. Let me give you some. First, policies to deny political and military gains and increase costs. First, international community should formally refuse to grant the status of even if a de facto nuclear weapon state to North Korea. That is denial strategy. At the same time, continue and further Pyongyang's isolation by naming and shaming those illicit weapons activity. That is punishment strategy. In this vein, it surely helps if the Obama administration is successful in strengthening the non-proliferation regime such that being a nuclear weapon state is more a liability than an asset. Second, from the military perspective, the US and South Korean allies should seek to deny or reduce military benefits of nuclear weapons and double its cost. One measure could be to make them realize the weapons are giving them less security, not anymore. I think President Obama was emphasizing that in his address in Japan. And I have written several times that by developing weapons capabilities, both in terms of missiles and weapons, warheads, North Korea is inviting, making themselves more insecure than secure because they are vulnerable to forced preemptive strike by its adversaries. Okay. But it takes not just words, but deeds. Already North Korean nuclear test led the U.S. to reaffirm its continued provision of a nuclear umbrella to South Korea and Japan. I think that is a blow to North Korea, which North Korea has long protested vehemently. Additional measures may include the threat, I'm not saying it's real, but the threat of the resumption of the team spirit exercise for the first time in 16 years, or rediscussion of the transfer of operational control from U.S. forces to South Korean forces, which were designed to become, scaled to become in 2 years. We may threaten it. Okay, if North Korea continue to do provocative stuff like that, we can do that. Second, the policy to deny economic benefits and increase cost. Third, international community should devise and take measures that are intended to deny any economic benefits from the weapons program and instead increase the cost. We should tighten international regimes that effectively blocks the trafficking of weapons and materials and thereby increase the procurement cost. While this subject shall be discussed later, I'll raise another issue. It is very important to develop and deep regional economic cooperation that benefits all the participants in exclusion of non-participants. Okay, North Korea is excluded, not because we include them, but they are excluded because of the weapon states. So if we go ahead with those kind of program that benefits us and relatively deprivates North Korea from non-participation, then it may lead North Korea to develop that kind of thing. I think it will take time, of course. But if we have lived with nuclear North for 20 years by now, why can't we wait for another 5 years? Secretary Steinberg mentioned what the strategic patient, it may include that kind of thing. But there's short-term measures. I think that is the most important and related to what I mentioned earlier. Even after proposing the above measures and first launching of theories, I wonder how relevant this would be for such an other region like Pyongyang. So it takes two of the gains and benefits from Pyongyang may count on today are political and military gains from blackmail strategy, okay, and foreign sales of the weapons materials. That is not a long-term strategy, but it could be very specific and it can take place tomorrow. So if for those short-term strategies, I am counting on kind of deterrence, firm deterrence measures and coercive diplomacies, where we must stand very strong, not to give up, and force to North Korea, even we can go to the brinkmanship that we have to bargain from the positions of the strengths. Okay, I'll stop here because time is limited.
I think you're just about out of time. All right, thank you. We turn now to Alexander Mansurov, specialist on Northeast Asian security politics and economics, and as mentioned, a visiting scholar currently at the U.S. Korea Institute at SAIS. We're delighted to welcome him, and I think he'll focus in part on a Russian perspective.
Yes.
Alexander.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to address this distinguished audience today. It gives me particular... first of all, let me express my appreciation to President Park Chae-gyu, to Chairman Lee Hamilton, to Christian Osterman, and to James Person for their kind invitation and for making this possible for me to join this event. It's so gratifying to be back at the Woodrow Wilson Center. 16 years ago, when a struggling graduate student was writing his dissertation, one of my advisors, Professor Gary Ledyard, suggested, you know what, Sasha, go to Woodrow Wilson Center. They may have some ideas which direction you should proceed. And with the help of Korea Society, Henry Luce Foundation, Columbia University, under the leadership of the Woodrow Wilson Center, I was able to go back to Moscow, visit a few archives, the Party Archive, the Foreign Ministry Archive, the Ministry of Defense Archive, collect a few documents which in total amounted to almost 3,000 pages of the key Russian documents on the Soviet involvement in the Korean War. Brought them back here, and they became, as I understand, the foundation of the Cold War North Korea International Documentation Project here 16 years ago. So now, 16 years later, when I see this audience here being enabled by that decision to make informative judgments about what's going on in Korea today, in North Korea today, I'm just at awe at the vision and the leadership of the Woodrow Wilson Center, which they displayed 16 years ago. And I'm sure on many other occasions as well, but I was a personal beneficiary of that particular decision, and so I'm profoundly grateful for that. Now, I was asked to talk about the Russian interests and policy on the Korean Peninsula. Let me start by outlining what are the main strategic objectives which, in my view, Russia pursues on the peninsula. Again, the history of the Russian-Korean relationship is long. I mean, it goes back to the mid-19th century, and Russia has always been part of the equation there. So, but what are those main strategic objectives today? Number one, I would say, to preserve international peace, and the way Russians would put it is, unjust peace is better than just war. That's kind of the bottom line there. Number two, it's to maintain domestic political stability in North Korea. Again, the way the Russians would put it is, the known evil is better than an unknown evil. And of course, we all want change in North Korea, but having lived through so much transformation and changes, bloody changes in Russia, they kind of developed a more moderate approach. The third strategic objective is to promote regional socioeconomic development, because the assumption is that a well-fed people is less dangerous than a hungry people. Now, in addition, the Russian diplomacy wants to make sure that Russia does participate in Korean affairs, especially in multilateral security talks and coordination of economic issues related to the economic assistance and development of North Korea. Of course, the guiding line there is to participate in everything, but not to enter anything, meaning any agreements that are signed. And that was pretty much the party line for the past, that's been the party line for the past 20 years, since the collapse of the former Soviet Union. Finally, it's to safeguard Russian interests on the peninsula, if not for now, then for future generations, whatever these interests may be. Of course, Russia regards North Korea also as a place where it can exercise strategic leverage in relations with the United States, China, and Japan, just using North Korea as a point of discussion where mutual bargaining can take place in the mutual interest. Now, what are the principal stakes for Russia in North Korean issues? One of the key stakes is, of course, to maintain, quote-unquote, political stability in Pyongyang. I believe that Moscow will not accept attempts to overthrow or undermine Kim Jong-il's regime, no matter how much they dislike it. And again, I'm not even sure that they dislike it all that much, because after all, apple does not fall far away from the apple tree. Of course, if the political situation is destabilized, then Moscow is afraid of potential negative geopolitical consequences, which can spill over across its borders. Now, of course, at the same time, Russia does not want to be perceived as merely bandwagoning with China in Northeast Asian politics and kind of lining up its interest with the Chinese positions on the Korean Peninsula. Now, the second principal stake in North Korean issues is, of course, related to the denuclearization of the peninsula. And as far as Moscow is concerned, I think partial denuclearization would be sufficient. And by partial, what they mean is that the Koreans in the north, they're entitled to the right to nuclear power for peaceful use. At the same time, nuclear weapons and obviously WMD proliferation out of North Korea is not acceptable. And when you talk to the Russian officials, they would always tell you that Russian expertise and capacities could be used for eventual dismantling of the DPRK's nuclear infrastructure and materials, deactivation, verification procedures, and other possible aspects of any kind of partial denuclearization of North Korea. Now, the next principal stake for Moscow in the North Korean issues is missile proliferation control. Again, here the position is not clear-cut. I mean, it's pretty clear-cut, but it has two phases. On the one hand, Moscow believes that North Korea has the right to peaceful exploration of space and peaceful satellite launches. Again, despite the fact that it reluctantly acquiesced to the latest UN Security Council resolution, still they believe that Pyongyang has this right, as well as the right to missile development for self-defense purposes. But for sale, that's where the red line seems to be. Now, as far as the conventional arms control and reduction is concerned, then again, Moscow supports the North Korean claims that they need to maintain enough weaponry for defensive self-sufficiency, and there is a definition of that, as opposed to offensive self-defense. Again, we don't want to go into detail. If you want, I can do it in the Q&A session. But again, Moscow supports the conventional armaments in North Korea for the purposes of defensive self-sufficiency as opposed to offensive self-defense, the way the North Koreans would characterize it. Now, in addition, what Russia would like to see in North Korea, and that's always been part of the discussion with for the past 6 decades, it's to have access to the North Korean ports for trade, to have passage through the North Korean airspace, and of course to have access to the North Korean exclusive economic zone. Access, in addition to access to strategic natural deposits in North Korea. As a matter of fact, just a quick reminder, when, of course, Stalin decided to go ahead with the Korean adventure back in 1950 and authorized the dramatic increase in shipments of Soviet armaments to rearm the KPA, one way the North Koreans paid for that was by supplying the uranium ore to Moscow. And in 1950, in exchange for T-32 tanks and for the Soviet aircraft, the North Koreans supplied several thousands of tons of the uranium ore. So this is to say that nuclear exports, is not a new idea in North Korea or in the North Korean-Soviet relationship as such. The arms for nukes kind of trade has been part of the equation since the beginning of the North Korean regime and since the beginning of the relationship between the Soviet state and its satellite on the Korean Peninsula. As far as curtailing North Korean illegitimate activities inside Russia, like the crime activities in which some of the North Koreans are involved in terms of drug trafficking and so on and so forth, that seems to be a local news, and it doesn't really hit the radar screen in the Kremlin. Now, another principal stake for Moscow is promoting regional infrastructure development. And of course, Russian officials like to talk about the connection of the Trans-Siberian Railway and Trans-Korean Railway, reconnection of the electricity grids and pipelines, and rehabilitation of the Soviet-built North Korean industrial enterprises. Personally, I believe that these are just myths. I mean, as long as I've been studying North Korea, watching North Korea since my days in Pyongyang, and this is like more than a quarter of a century by now, we've been talking about it and talking about it and talking about it, and I don't really see much development there. And given the kind of deteriorating international situation, environment around North Korea with all the sanctions piling on, I don't really see anytime soon that how Trans-Siberian, Trans-Korean railways will be reconnected, or the grids, or the pipeline built. And again, there are a lot of interests, bureaucratic interests, corporate interests, let alone geopolitical concerns that kind of hamper the regional infrastructural integration. Now, obviously, debt settlement is of concern to Moscow. As you know, North Korea owes more than $8 billion to Moscow. But that can wait, although that's a thorny issue in the bilateral relationship, but clearly it takes the kind of back burner. As far as economic changes in North Korea are concerned, Moscow believes they're a good idea. Economic reforms, they must be promoted. But the improvement of human rights, that's kind of regarded as an internal matter of North Korea, and it's never discussed. You can read in the press about the treatment of North Korean laborers in Khabarovsk or Altai, working in the timber stations there. But really, it's not an issue in the bilateral relationship. Finally, let me say a few words about the key priorities for the Kremlin on the peninsula. The number one priority, of course, is to maintain, to kind of reinvigorate the multilateral negotiations and to make sure that compromise is always preferred to the international sanctions, let alone any war-type option. As far as, in my belief, the Russian position is that military conflict on the peninsula is worse than the existence of a nuclear North Korea that behaves responsibly. So that's the kind of bottom line. Of course, after North Korea's two nuclear tests, 2006 and 2009, Russia began to demonstrate some lukewarm support for the United Nations sanctions, and sanction resolutions, of course, were adopted. But really, I do not see much evidence of the Russian enforcement of these sanctions or compliance with the international embargoes. Another key priority is to encourage political, economic, and humanitarian contacts between two Koreas in the spirits of agreements reached at the summits in 2000 and 2007. Russia wants to mediate the North-South differences in such a way that A, would prevent inter-Korean armed conflict, B, frustrate increasing American domination of the peninsula, and C, slow down Chinese expansion on the peninsula. And on that note, let me conclude by saying that Moscow does want to see a unified Korean peninsula, Korean state, to be, quote-unquote, fully sovereign, because today Moscow does not regard South Korea as a fully sovereign state. Friendly and close to Russia without foreign troops on its soil. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Sasha. Now, to start us off into our discussion, we have Professor Kyljay Ryo here. I failed to mention earlier that aside from his affiliation at the University of North Korean Studies, he is also now a member of the Policy Advisory Committee to the Senior Secretary of the ROK President and to the Ministry of Unification. Professor Ryo also is the chair of the Committee on North Korea and Unification of the Korean Association of International Studies, and he was also integrally involved in designing the program for this event. So it's a great pleasure to turn the mic over to him. Kyljay.
Thank you, Christian. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As Christian said, this event was made by the partnership between UNKS and Udruž Center. And I as an organizer, one of the organizers, I really I'm happy to be here and have an opportunity to present my idea. And we have the time limit, so let me try to make my presentation shorter, as briefly as possible. As you all understand very well, the North Korean problem is not only a problem strictly of the Korean Peninsula and the Northeast Asia region, and it's very natural, but it is one for the global community to deal with as a global issue. The nuclear issue is now a quagmire to the stakeholder nations, but it's also touchstone to achieve global non-proliferation goals. In the meantime, the uncertainty surrounding the DPRK's regime sustainability has recently increased dramatically, mostly because of Chairman Kim Jong-il's ill health. If a nuclear-armed Pyongyang falters in the future, maybe not long-term future is very possible is short-term future. Its regime might become a nightmare to its neighbors, including South Korea. Thus, this nearly intractable problem needs to be addressed now by everyone. Let me argue that one of the main reasons the nuclear issue has not been solved is because of the wide gap in the positions and or interests among the stakeholder nations, even if the critical reason can be seen as Pyongyang's obstinacy in its nuclear policy. Secondly, resolution of this nearly intractable nuclear issue does not mean the problem of North Korea will be solved. It won't. Both issues are intertwined, and thus their resolution requires us to take an integrated approach. Thirdly and lastly, South Korea, the most concerned party to the negotiations, can and should take a coordinating role in the consensus building that is needed among the parties in order to solve the nuclear issue. Since 1993, the nuclear issue raised by North Korea has been trouble to stakeholder nations. The reason this could not be solved is no doubt Pyongyang's strong desire to have the nuclear weapons. It is so easy and even legitimate to criticize Pyongyang for its trial to develop a nuclear program, because Pyongyang deserves to be blamed on the simple ground that it cannot feed its people. However, regarding nuclear issue, North Korea has had the clear and consistent position, so to speak, enforcement to develop nuclear arsenal as far as it cannot be compensated with appropriate rewards. On the other hand, the stakeholder nations have shown different policies based on their national interests and even on the government's inclination and interests. For example, China seems to prefer the engagement policy to encourage the economic reform and to stimulate the economic cooperation in order for the Northeast regime not to falter. However, Lee Myung-bak government of South Korea no doubt sticks to denuclearization as the denuclearization opening and 3,000 is North Korea policy. Unlike the past two governments, Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun governments, which had been obsessed by the engagement policy. And so the different, depending on the countries, nations, and even the governments. This means that the structure of the nuclear negotiation is asymmetrical, and it would be very difficult for the stakeholder nations to have consensus. In 2009, North Korea looked to start the policy game in this multifaceted interests among stakeholder nations. and thus consensus building and dealing with nuclear issue and North Korea problem should be needed. As Deputy Secretary Steinberg also emphasized, but how will it be possible? That is the problem. Let's begin by assuming that the 6 parties to the 6-party talks will reach a compromise. What then? We can expect that North Korea would dismantle its nuclear weapons facilities, materials, and programs. If so, then would North Korea no longer be a threat to peace and stability in Northeast Asia? Or it is obvious that other issues like human rights, conventional biochemical weapons, counterfeiting, and so forth will rise to the foreground and need to be dealt with. Even if Pyongyang does receive enormous amounts of economic aid from the international community based on a comprehensive deal involving the United States, or even a similar thing is proposed by the South Korean Lee Myung-bak government, without reform and open-door policy in North Korea, such a deal will be superseded. This is very rough prediction, I know. However, it is clear to me that even if North Korea accepts a compromise to resolve the nuclear issue, such negotiation won't necessarily mean that the problem of North Korea, what I call the North Korea problem, will go away. So far, Pyongyang has not showed clearly if it were to undertake reform, whether it be Chinese or Vietnamese style reform. Pyongyang has wanted economic assistance that does not intervene with or have any great influence on the country's existing economic system and policy direction. Kim Jong-il might envision economic rehabilitation without systemic reform and extensive opening. In this regard, the currency exchange measures of November 30th, 2009 can be seen a culmination of the move to restore and strengthen the socialist planned economy, which had been derailed by the economic hardship since the mid-1990s. This persistent attitude towards reform policy is incompatible with the economic assistance from the international society, even after the nuclear compromise. It implies that the North Korean economic crisis will remain even after a compromise is made on the nuclear issue. And it is no doubt that the long-term economic crisis will promote political crisis in the post-Kim Jong-il era. In this context, the stakeholder nations should encourage Pyongyang to adopt reform policy while negotiating denuclearization. But how? And still, we have as a great task. The most urgent agenda, I feel, is consensus building among the 5 stakeholder nations of the 6-party talks, with expansion of the common interest. With that as a basis, it might be then possible to establish an international network to implement an engagement policy that will encourage reform and open the policy in North Korea. That is the nexus of the North Korea problem. The essence of this process will be ultimately to construct a multilateral cooperation framework in Northeast Asia and establish international engagement towards North Korea under such a framework. It will focus on eliciting commitment from Pyongyang to international norms and contracts while providing reassurance that this would be favorable to their regime as well. My view, the stakeholder nations, I think it is very, very difficult for them to have a compromise, not a compromise in nuclear negotiation. It's compromise is a way to the consensus among the 5 nations. And I think the South Korea is has the proper position to coordinate or help and so which can make lots of opportunity to contact and dialogue as among the 5 nations, and so even if they can have the different interests, but they can approach to the compromise of the ultimate goal or vision. And I think currently that is the very, very important thing. And also the South Korea as a must need to have such a role. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kiljae. And with that, the floor is open. We'll hold the applause. The floor is open for question and comments. We have about 15, 20 minutes for Q's and A's. Yes. Please wait for the microphone, and in Wilson Center tradition, please state your name and affiliation.
Thank you, David Steinberg, the other David Steinberg. There's been a lot of talk this morning about anniversaries, but no one has mentioned the anniversary of 2012 and the 100th anniversary of Kim Il-sung's birth. Does that anniversary affect North Korean attitudes towards the nuclear power and nuclear affairs?
Who'd like to tackle this question? 2012.
I mean, those already made it clear that by 2012 they will make their nation strong and prosperous nation. As they it's a deadline because of the birthday of Kim Il-sung. I don't know whether they'll be successful or not, but anyway, that they keenly aware of that. So probably, if they felt and made it a strong and prosperous state by the end of 2012, they may give up nuclear weapons.
Charles, would you have any comments on this?
Well, it is a very interesting prospect. 2012 is not that far away. It doesn't seem likely that North Korea is going to succeed in, by any objective measure, becoming a prosperous nation. I mean, the question is, if they don't, what will happen? Will we see some discontent and instability within North Korea if these goals are not met? Perhaps one of the other panelists can discuss the prospects for that.
Could I?
Yeah, sure.
This is an interesting question. And of course, 2012, I don't believe there is a linkage between 2012 and the nuclear status. But if there is a linkage between 2012 and the leadership transition schedule, then indirectly you may link the two. Because clearly, maintenance of the nuclear deterrence and making part of Kim Jong-il's legacy and part of that will and inheritance which he will give to whoever his successor is part of the game plan. And if 2012, is the date around which, we'll see some movement in the succession process, then yes, I can see how it could be linked to the consolidation of the North Korean nuclear status.
Thank you. Gentleman up front here.
Thank you very much. Paul Chamberlain. Of course, when we think about Kim Il-sung's birthday, Korea was unified at the time of his birth, and it's not now. Right now, the United States and the other countries are pursuing a policy which, at some level of analysis, implies the perpetuation of 2 Koreas forever. And one of them will probably be nuclear armed, and the other might have yearnings in that extent after a while. So the question is, would it be better to step away from this process, which is focusing on trying to woo a North Korea back to the fold when it clearly doesn't want to? Would it be better to consider as an alternative a policy, a strategy to work towards the peaceful unification of Korea as a non-nuclear weapon state?
Thank you.
Could I try to? This morning, Secretary Steinberg talked about strategic patience, which, by the way, the U.S. has been strategically patient for a long time, and what you're saying is we can be strategically patient for many, many decades to come. I believe strategic patience means that we're just waiting out for Kim Jong-il. You know, we're waiting when he's gone from the scene, hoping that the successive regime will be much weaker and much more willing to kind of negotiate away or give up the nuclear arsenal. So that's the nature, that's the driver behind the strategic patience concept. I think it's misguided, and this is my personal opinion, because the problem is that, yes, the next leadership will be much weaker than this current one. And that's precisely why we have a better chance to get a deal and get the North Koreans to surrender the weapons under Kim Jong-il when Kim Jong-il runs the country with an iron fist, and he can make it happen, as opposed to any of his successor, who will be forced to cling to the nuclear arsenal as the only way to maintain his or her legitimacy and as the only way to preserve that regime. And plus, the longer we wait, the more the North Koreans come accustomed to the idea that they're nuclear power and they have all the right to live with it. So I think that instead of clinging to this, pursuing this policy of strategic patience, we should switch it to strategic flexibility that would open up some possibilities for us. Look what we did with Belarus. You know, nobody likes Lukashenko and the totalitarian regime which he runs there, but they don't have nuclear weapons. And we seem to be able to live with that regime. And that, if we adopt strategic flexibility, then we will be able to step away from our 60-decade-old policy of maintaining kind of two separate regimes on the peninsula and start kind of exploring new ideas. You make a peace treaty with the North, you kind of start really engaging the North, and guess one day there is no longer North Korea as we know it, and the next day there is no divided peninsula as we know it. So maybe, again, strategic flexibility might be a better way to go as opposed to just sit and wait until Kim Jong-il dies and then we'll try to put the squeeze on his successors.
Thank you. Would Kilje or would you like to, Dr. Kim, to comment on this? Or?
I'll wait another question.
Okay. The gentleman in the white shirt.
Will Amatruda. Dr. Ryu, you mentioned that the North Korean regime has concluded that its survival is closely linked to maintaining a centrally planned economy. If Kim Jong-il is succeeded by his youngest son, he would be the new leader would be the first North Korean leader to have direct personal experience with the West. Could you comment on the theory that this might induce more flexibility and openness to changes in the North Korean economic system?
Thank you.
Your question is the relation between the succession and the economic changing. I think the Kim Jong-il regime, Kim Jong-il, as I mentioned in my presentation, Kim Jong-il had no option to make its economic system and policy change. But the North Korea is since mid-1990s because of economic hardship, and so unofficial the area is expanded, and what we call the marketization is quite different from the capitalist market system. But anyway, the market, the area expanded, and many people have maintained their lives as depending upon the market, the underground market, not more anymore than underground. But anyway, so around the 2005, the North Korean government is started to control the underground market, and they make the market is to decrease, and last year's the money, the currency exchange is I mentioned the culmination of the control, but I think recently the North Korea is the candidate of leader, the third son of Kim Jong-il, has been reported to outside world as the successor. I think those move to restore strengthening of the socialist economic system, and the successor, her successor's rise is now is going parallel. So I think if her successor will succeed, the power maybe so we cannot we can hardly expect that the change, economic systems change or policy changes, as we cannot expect, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Gentleman all the way in the back. Yeah, right there.
Thank you very much. I'm Joe Winder. I have a question for you, Dr. Kim. The analogy with the Cuban Missile Crisis breaks down in the case of North Korea, because it was the United States and Soviet Union, of course, and the Soviet Union was the one that pulled the missiles out of Cuba. The Cubans were furious. They wouldn't have given up those missiles for anything. Now, in the case of North Korea, can you construct a situation whereby the United States, China, and Russia might be able to come up with some coercive measures that would not threaten the stability of the regime in North Korea, but would force them to give up their nuclear weapons? Now, Sasha, you said the Russians would be happy as long as the North Koreans behave, to keep nuclear in North Korea as long as they behave. That begs the question. The question is, what if they don't behave? Strategic flexibility is good with Belarus because they don't have nukes. The North Koreans still have nukes. And so the fundamental issue is, can we squeeze it? Is there anything that can get a consensus that would squeeze the North Koreans enough to force them to give up the nukes without threatening regime stability, at least in the minds of the Chinese leadership?
Thank you.
I remember that political scientist Kenneth Waltz argued that as long as nuclear weapon states behave responsibly, the more the better. Okay? The world will be stable if the more people possess nuclear weapons. That assumes that North Korea behaves responsibly. I really wonder what is utility of North Korean nuclear weapons to them. I mean, they may become all of a sudden become responsible after their security is guaranteed. But what about the case, historical argument that whenever you have power, more power, you become irresponsible? I mean, each car was emphasized that the more power you have, your aim has changed. So the mandate from the United Nations to the General MacArthur during the Korean War was expand North Korea to the north of 38 parallel, but success brought him to the making part to all the way to Yalu River. And in Iraqi case, it was a kind of Operation Desert Shield. All of a sudden, success led to the Desert Storm. So once North Korea may want nuclear weapons as a deterrence measures, but once they have it, I think they can behave irrationally, irresponsibly, seeking some kind of blackmail diplomacy. I'm saying that at this moment, I'm not saying that any coercive measures will be needed or possible to do so, but what I'm saying is while we are developing a long-term measures, okay, one way or another, to induce North Korea to give up the weapons voluntarily, but if they do some kind of short-term provocative acts, then those surrounding parties must stand firm collectively to discourage North Korea from further doing that and thinking again about the utility of not having nuclear weapons over the long run. So that was my point. And the difficulty, of course, is that if you look at the literature, either on deterrence or coerce diplomacy, the hardest case is when you have multiple coercers or multiple deterrers, and we have multiple coercers, multiple deterrers at the moment in terms of United States, China, and Russia, and so on. So coordination among stakeholders are all the more important otherwise.
Thank you. Sasha?
Secretary Steinberg said today that the U.S. security alliances in the region help us overcome the security dilemma which we face. Of course, if you look on the North Korean side of the equation, if anything, the alliance is gone, at least with Russia, with China, kind of, it's unclear. And their security dilemma has so much been exacerbated in the past several decades. If we feel insecure about what the North Koreans are doing, imagine how much more insecure they feel about what we are doing. Now, to answer your question, last year was an amazing year in one regard, and that is we slapped sanctions on North Korea, kind of trying to isolate them. And guess what? The North Korean-Chinese military-to-military exchanges doubled. And most of these exchanges actually happened after the sanctions were put on North Korea. The kind of bench line is about 5 senior visits per year. Last year, it was 10. And yes, it was the year of friendship between North Korea and China. Yeah, China had some major anniversaries, like 60th anniversary of the founding of their fleet, of the Air Force, but still, I mean, defense ministers, deputy defense ministers, general staff officials, general political department officials, regional commanders, deputy commanders going back and forth. What's going on there? Clearly, the North Korean military is the dominant force in North Korea, is seeking reassurances from China bilaterally as one way to, if not overcome their security dilemma, and the Chinese seem to be willing to entertain that track as opposed to just letting North Korea going nuclear all the way and, behaving like a rogue. So, again, if indeed all these reinvigorated mill-to-mill exchanges between North Korea and China will end up with producing some greater sense of reassurance in Pyongyang that Beijing, will live up to its obligations under the Mutual Defense Treaty and will not let that, state, let alone the regime, crack under the external force, then, that would be one way to resolve this problem. But again, that would mean tightening of the alliance, North Korean Chinese, which has already been tightened dramatically, and China, is a major force in the peninsula, and we'll talk about it in the afternoon. But that would be my way to go about it.
Very good. The lady in the center there.
Thank you. Nicole Finneman from the Korea Economic Institute. I'd like to ask about the translation of stakeholders' roles with North Korea into their roles in the six-party talk regime itself. I run a six-party talk simulation at universities across the country, and I found I had to change the simulation because no one wanted to play Russia. They thought, yes, everybody agrees they had to be there, but that they would just be there, and they thought they wouldn't really participate much in the simulation. My question is there any impetus or motivation in Russia, in the ROK, in the US for that to change? Or is everybody sort of happy with making a trip to Moscow if there's time?
Great question. Sasha?
Look, it just reflects the lack of knowledge and understanding of the role of Russia. Traditionally on the peninsula, north and south, it's not a comment on you, it's a comment on, because of course, Russia now these days is not as significant a player as China, for example. but clearly, it has significant presence in Korea. North Koreans listen to what Moscow says. Russians kind of understand what North Korea is going through. They've been there, they've done it, they've seen it. Ideally, I'd say, as far as Moscow is concerned, would be transition in Pyongyang from the today's type of regime to down the Putin's road. When the country will be run by the national security establishment, which already runs the country, North Korea, but which would allow the economic forces to come into play and allow the market forces to come into play, bypassing the Yeltsin-style kind of democratic period with all the chaos and anarchy. And Kim Jong-il, maybe one way or another, is trying to orchestrate, in Moscow's opinion, that kind of transition, where his party will still maintain the monopoly on power, his clan, his regime, while the economy will be a little bit more efficient, a little bit more productive, and the law and order will be firmly maintained by the overwhelming national security establishment. And that's the role model which Russia offers to North Korea, as a matter of fact. And North Koreans are willing to listen to it. So why, people on the outside, they don't see, that's, again, the problem.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, so let me take a couple more questions, and we'll take 2 or 3, and then give the panelists one final chance to. Yes, so go ahead in the center there in the red, yellow sweater.
Thanks for giving me the chance to ask questions. It seems like international community is taking offensive and threatening way to approach the North Korea about the nuclear weapons. But one of the concerns is this threatening approach creates counter-reactions, such as black markets, and as Mr. Mansurov mentioned, that there is a stronger bondage between China and North Korea about the military defense systems. So how we can prevent or control these counter-reactions?
Thank you. And if you could pass the microphone, just, yep.
Thank you. Greg Scarlatti, Korea Economic Institute. Deputy Secretary Steinberg has mentioned that one of the lessons learned is that we should avoid rewarding actions that can be reversed. One example of an irreversible action by North Korea was the 2002 admission of the existence of 13 Japanese abductees during the summit meeting with Prime Minister Koizumi, and they failed to reap any benefits from that admission, of course, due to primarily to the backlash, the popular backlash in Japan that even Prime Minister Koizumi may have failed to predict. Do you think they have also learned a lesson from that? Do you think Chairman Kim Jong-il and the leadership of North Korea may regard that as a mistake? And do you think that has added to their reluctance to proceed with any such actions that may be reversible?
Thank you. And the gentleman on the left there has been patiently waiting. Yep.
Yeah, Bill Jones, EIR. I'd like to ask a question of Sasha on the railroads again. I found the comments, I guess, pretty accurate. It seemed very disappointing in one sense. I understand that there is a railroad being taken through to the port, one of the ports in North Korea. And, of course, the railroad now, after the Chinese-Russian agreements in October, where the Chinese have essentially agreed to finance a lot of the modernization of the Russian rail, is going to change the nature of the situation in that whole area. Building of new ports, building of new rail connections. And this is a major shift in Russia-China relations as well. And I think, creating that kind of environment around this area of North Korea is going to show the difference and also probably be the kind of carrot that would be needed for them to move in that direction. There's a great deal of paranoia in North Korea. Overcoming that paranoia is one of the more key elements. And maybe the Chinese military exchanges is helpful rather than harmful in that respect, because The only countries that really gave up their nuclear weapons were not, as was noted, the Cuban situation, but Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus, because they didn't feel, different situation. They're not as irrational. They're not as Machiavellian. But they saw their benefit in giving up the weapons rather than retaining them. And that's the kind of situation you want to have in very complicated country like North Korea if you're going to have any success.
Thank you. Okay, let me turn it over to Sasha and then give the others, if they'd like, a chance to respond, and then we'll conclude.
On the railroad, you're right. The new small railroad track is being built to one of the ports in North Korea, but that's to give access to the port. That's the only reason for that railroad to be built. The Chinese want to ship all their goods. It's another entry point to the Pacific Ocean for them, to the ports on the eastern coast of Korea. So it will not have any links, to the North Korean national railway system to speak of, let alone it will not enable any kind of linkage between South Korean railway network and Trans-Siberian railway network. And that's really the kind of the holy grail there, is to connect South Korean railway network with the Trans-Siberian railway network. I don't think this is coming anytime soon. On the lessons which North Koreans may or may not have learned from that abduction confession and the confessional diplomacy in general, whether it works or not, I kind of originally I used to think that yes, Kim Jong-il felt bitter about it. Really betrayed. Very hard feelings, a lot of hard feelings. And never again, the national security establishment in North Korea clearly was opposed then and will always be opposed to any type of confession in the future. And my advice to the Japanese was, look, again, don't wait until Kim Jong-il passes from the scene. Talk to him, because his successor, they will burn all the archives and they'll say, oh, sorry, that's the old regime. We just don't know what happened under the old regime, at the very least. But they will not have the political capital, to confess to anything. But if you look what they did before Bosphorus trip to Pyongyang, in a way, they front-loaded all the bad news. Before he went to Pyongyang, they made a whole bunch of disclosures, including about the HEU, as if, they've learned the lesson from 2002 on that quote-unquote non-confession during the Kelly's visit, and decided, okay, let's not surprise Americans during the visit. Let's kind of front-load all the bad news before the visit, so we'll clear the decks, and maybe then, the visit will be a little bit more successful than the previous one. So on the successional diplomacy, again, we have two types of kind of follow-up action, both positive and negative. So it's hard to say whether it's a negative or positive lesson for that.
Thank you. Let's hope they won't burn the archives. Dr. Kim, any...
Due to time limit, there is a section I could mention at the end. So it is entitled "The Power of Soft Power." I'm referring to your concern about reactions. You have to use positive and negative sanctions to induce your opponent, your target, to comply your will. But it's all the more better if you make North Korea to give up their weapons gladly, not grudgingly. Okay, so that is the important positive sanctions, and I'm referring to several, but there are several ways you have to consider. That is, the carrot of positive inducements for quid pro quo is, I think, unavoidable in ongoing bargaining, but I think we should never call it a prize for the North Korea's program that they may think they deserve, because they will have no upper ceiling over that price they will ask in coming elections. And second is, I think this is very important, to win the battle for Casus Belli. We have to obtain our own legitimacy of pursuing denuclearization of North Korea. And North Korea is challenging international community, and their action is irresponsible. The third is, if necessary, win the battle of guts. And third, there's still, again, diplomatic prudence is the key argument for this entire business. Thank you.
Thank you. Charles, any final words?
Yes, just a couple of things. First of all, I think history shows that, if nothing else, The word patience came up. No one outdoes the North Koreans for patience, so let's not expect to outweight them. About the linkage between the nuclear issue and stability, if, as seems to be the case, the North Korean leadership rests their legitimacy, at least in part, on the possession of nuclear weapons, then it will be very difficult for them to give them up without destabilizing the regime, especially if it fails to become visibly more prosperous by 2012, which is perhaps another reason that it's important to try to deal with Kim Jong-il now rather than wait for succession. It seems like there are three broad possibilities of where to go from here. One is a dramatic breakthrough to reach an agreement, which seems, as we've all heard today, probably not very likely. We don't know how he would do that. Second is, and I think which is more probable, to maintain a kind of strategic ambiguity of North Korea's possession of nuclear weapons as we continue to improve relations among the five parties with the DPRK. But there's one final possibility, which is rather depressing. I want to just throw it out there. There are examples, at least one in Asia, of a very poor, isolated regime that was kept alive and remains to be kept alive for a very indefinite period of time without really integrating into the global system, and that is Burma. I think it's a very depressing possibility, but not beyond the range of happening, that we can see North Korea going down that road of indefinitely muddling through.
Thank you. You started us off with some depressing thoughts, and you end us with some pessimism.
Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. Big thank you to the panelists. I'd now like to invite you to join us for the luncheon with Ambassador Detrani, Director of the National Counterproliferation Center. The lunch is overbooked, so first of all, I'd like to make sure that those who have been confirmed on a first-serve, first-come basis, first-come, first-served basis to join us. But my hope is that we'll have space for everybody involved, for everybody who's here. If not, there will also be a simultaneous video in the boardroom, as well as sandwiches there. So thank you again. Thanks to the panelists. Thank you.